Good morning, everyone. Thanks for dialing in and joining. As you can see from the slides, this is our session on the dedicated schools grant and other grants. Okay, so we're going to start just with just a summary, obviously, of all the grants that are available this year to local authorities and to schools accordingly. I don't intend to go through every one of these grants individually in a lot of detail. Most, if not all of them, I'm sure will be familiar to everyone on the call. There are a couple of grants on here that are new for the forthcoming 22-23 year, so I will touch on those briefly. And for any that you're not familiar with, we have included links to the latest published guidance on each of them on the slides accordingly. So if there are any that are unfamiliar to you, then there are some information there to assist you accordingly. But as we go through these slides, I will just touch on a couple of grants briefly as we work through, just to mention anything of note that's important for you to be aware of. So that being the case, at the bottom of this first slide, you can see we've got the Teachers Pay Grant and the Teachers Pension Employer Contribution Grant. Just to say in relation to these grants, through some conversations I've had with early years colleagues, there has been a recent consultation that's just concluded, which covered in part the possibility of rolling the early years element of teachers pension, teachers pay grants and teachers pension grants into early years national funding formula from 23-24 onwards. That consultation has now concluded, and we are expecting a response on the consultation to be published in the autumn with some further details on that. But that has been discussed in this latest consultation that's just concluded. And as far as the post-16 element is concerned, effective from 22-23, the post-16 element of the teachers' pay grant has now been rolled into 16-19 core funding as well. In terms of universal infant preschool meals, again, just to advise on that particular grant, that we have now published the allocations and conditions of grants accordingly for 22-23. So those are linked on the slide you can see there, just to be aware. For the PE Sports Premium grant, we just want to make the case that that grant is definitely returning for 22-23. We don't as yet have the conditions of grant for 22-23 available and published on gov.uk. So you will find that link on the slide there will take you to the 21-22 conditions of grant, which are the latest ones we have. But it is just to make the case that in the absence of those conditions of grant being available, the grant is certainly returning. We do expect those conditions of grant to be available very, very shortly on gov.uk as well. In terms of these grants, just some important things to note. So in reference to senior mental health leads, we'd just like to make a reminder that schools and colleges that have claimed that grant in the 21-22 financial year wouldn't be eligible to apply for the grant this year. And that would include any academy converters where a claim was made by their predecessor school. For the cadets school staff instructor, it's much the same as I just mentioned with PE and Sports Premium. The conditions of grant and allocations for cadets, again, aren't yet published at the moment, but again, the grant is certainly returning for 22-23. So once again, the link you've got there is to the 21-22 guidance, which is the most up-to-date information we have, but we do expect announcements on the specific funding for that grant to be available very shortly. On Homes for Ukraine, so this is a grant which is paid in 4 instalments over the coming year. The first instalment was already paid a month or so ago, but local authorities will be well aware that that first payment they had, which was to cover arrivals into the UK from March to May, was only for 25% of what should have been the total amount of that payment. So the next instalment of that payment, which is due to be paid at the end of October, will be made up of 2 elements. It'll be the remaining 75% that's still owing from that first instalment that was paid a month or so ago, and it will also cover the payment for any arrivals that have come into the UK from the period June to August of 2023 as well. In terms of recovery premium, just something to highlight to you, which is that there is a slight change this year to the payment dates. So again, like Homes for Ukraine, recovery premium is paid in 4 instalments through the year. In 21-22, the third instalment of that payment was paid in April and May. April for local authority maintained schools and May for academies. This year for 22-23, there's been a slight change to that third instalment, and instead it's now going to be paid at the end of March for local authority maintained schools and the beginning of April for academies. So it's just been brought forward ever so slightly by a month. The primary pupil rate for that grant will remain as £145, but secondary pupil rates are going to be £276 for the 22-23 year. And just a point to note there on the National Tutoring Programme, which is that for 22-23, the funding will be paid directly to schools, albeit via local authorities if you're an LA maintained school, or academy trusts if you're an academy. And schools will have the autonomy to assess which form of tutoring support is going to be most beneficial for their pupils, obviously going down any one of the three routes being academic mentors, tuition partners, or school-led tutoring accordingly. So that's just, as I say, a high level of the grants that are available through this coming year. We're just going to move on and talk a little bit about the dedicated schools grant more specifically. Hopefully, as you'll see from these next few slides, much of what's in place for dedicated schools grant will look very familiar in terms of the arrangements. It is still the standard 4 blocks that will make up the funding accordingly. Local authorities will continue to have that autonomy and flexibility around block movements to a certain degree. So local authorities will be able to transfer up to 0.5% out of the school's block to another block. That, of course, is caveated by ensuring that you do have approval from schools forum. Movement out of the early years block to any other block is also allowed once again, providing that a schools forum consultation has taken place, and also on the caveat that any pass-through rate condition is also still satisfied accordingly. Movement out of the higher needs block to any other block is also allowed once again, under the pretense for consultation with schools forum having taken place, along with relevant representatives on the schools forum and providers likely to be affected. And again, movement out of the central school services block to schools block is also allowed, again through the pre-mentioned consultation with schools forum accordingly. Local authorities will also have the ability to apply to disapply certain regulations around funding accordingly using our disapplications process. I'm not going to spend any time going into great detail on the disapplication process itself, because we have a separate LA workshop that's already scheduled to discuss that in more detail. So I would just signpost that to everyone for next week on the 29th of September. For those of you that are not as familiar with the disapplication process or haven't gone through it before, we would recommend attending that session, because we will talk in more detail about the pro forma that's used to apply for a disapplication, and an advice on how to complete that pro forma and the sorts of information we look for and how we assess them. That said, I have just put a few key deadlines on the slide there for you to be aware of. So the 18th of November 22 is the crucial deadline for any local authorities that are wanting to make movements out of the schools block that are above that aforementioned 0.5% threshold. And any movements out of the schools block that don't have schools forum approval, but where the local authority still wishes to proceed with making the movement, again, the 18th of November will be the deadline to make that disapplication request on that basis. And then further to that, we have a 13th of January deadline, and that's essentially the final deadline for any local authority to make an amendment to an existing disapplication they've submitted where they've seen a significant change in circumstances. And there's some examples there, such as a demand for high needs provision has changed significantly from when the disapplication was first submitted, or perhaps final numbers on the census are significantly different from what was expected originally. In terms of payments and assurance, payments for DSG for this coming year, again, will look very familiar in terms of the rates of instalments. So it'll be 25 instalments, which breaks down as 2 per month across most of the year, with the exception of April. And as far as assurance is concerned, it will be the usual requirement for a chief finance officer to submit a signed statement to the department, which just gives that confirmation that the DSG conditions of grant have been adhered to in line with the grant accordingly. Just to touch very briefly on balances and deficits. So any DSG underspend can be carried forward to the next financial year, so long as it's only spent on the school's budget. The school's forum should be consulted about the use of any underspend, and forum consent is required where it's going to be used for central budgets. As far as DSG deficits are concerned, there are 3 options that local authorities are able to consider, which are to either carry forward all of the deficit and set it off against the school's budget in the next financial year. Conversely, there is an option to carry forward part of the deficit and set it off against the school's budget in the next financial year, thereby carrying the rest forward to the following financial year. Or there's the option to not set any deficit against the school's budget in the next financial year and carry forward all of the deficit to the following financial year accordingly. For any part of the deficit carried forward to the next financial year, it is the DSG in that year that must be used to eliminate the deficit. Conversely, any part of a deficit carried forward to the following financial year will need to be recovered from the DSG it receives in that year. We do stress the point that Secretary of State consent is mandatory where the local authority wishes to either use its general funds to recover a DSG deficit or add general funds to its school's budget. And that final bullet point there on the slide that I've put in bold text is just in anticipation of a question that may have come up in this session, and to try and head it off, which is the question around ring fencing requirements, and the stipulation about DSG deficits being held in separate reserves in local authority accounts. We are still awaiting a decision on what the position for that will be beyond 22-23. We haven't had a firm steer as yet, so naturally, when we do have a confirmation on where things stand with that, we will communicate it more widely. But as of now, we don't know the position of that particular point beyond the 22-23 year at this stage. I'll touch very briefly on the allocations. You'll see, not on this slide, but on the next one, I have provided a link to the Schools Ops Guide that's been published for 23-24. That Schools Ops Guide goes down into a lot more detail about the allocations and how they're made up. So these next few slides are just, as I say, very high level information for you to be aware of, which are that for 23-24, we expect the allocations to be published in December 22. The school spot will be allocated using the primary and secondary units of funding published in July 2022, and that'll be multiplied by the number of pupils recorded in the October 2022 school census. High needs allocations will be those published in July 2022 using the high needs national funding formula and basic entitlement, and it will include the updated high needs pupil numbers from the October 2022 census accordingly as well. In terms of central services schools block, that will be allocated using the unit of funding for ongoing commitments published in July 2022, multiplied by the same pupil numbers for October 2022, using the census, same October 22 census used in the schools block, and also historic commitments funding. So we'll apply the protection to ensure historic commitments cannot fall below the total value of ongoing termination of employment and prudential borrowing. And again, we've got the mailbox there for obviously any local authorities that may be affected by that. And as far as early years blocks allocations, once again, it's December 22 that we're expecting the provisional allocations to be published for the early years block accordingly. And as I say, the link is there to the main latest published Schools Ops Guide for further detail on that. We've just got some final slides here that are just going to summarise when you can expect to see revisions to the various allocations for 23-24, as well as also just some dates that summarise when these various grants can be expected to be paid through the year. In terms of the revisions or the updates to the allocations, these are in the main mostly affected by when we see schools convert to academy status through the year. So as you can see for March 23, we will expect the schools block and high needs block to be updated, and that's in recognition of those academy conversions that took place after November of 2022. In the spring of 23, we'll see the high needs block updated, and that's just in reflection of the new cross-border data for the import-export adjustment. And then once again, in recognition of academy conversions we expect after March of 2023, we'll do obviously another revision to the schools block and high needs block in July of 23 of that year. And then once again, as you can see, we've got further updates expected in November 23, February 24, and March 24. And that again is all in recognition of those academy conversions we expect being in July 22, November 22, or February and March 24 respectively. And then finally, there'll be an update in July 24 just to reflect the early years block for the latest census data that we expect to come in. In terms of the timetable for ESFA grant payments, so again, I won't go through all of these one by one because, as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, most of them are sort of familiar and haven't changed from what you're familiar with already. Just a few to touch on, which are for universal infant free school meals, we've got an initial payment that was made in June of 2022, and that was for 7/12 of the grant. The remaining final allocation will be paid in July of 2023, and that will of course be made subtracting away from it any payment that was already paid in June 2022 accordingly. For the PE Sport and Premium grants, again, from speaking with colleagues that are leading on that grant, we have been confirmed that the payment dates are expected to still be October of 2022 for this year for that grant. As I say, the conditions of grant and allocations aren't published as yet, but we expect when they are published that they will reflect that is the intention for payment. Colleagues were keen to highlight that when the conditions of grant are published to review them thoroughly, because there may be some changes this year to the conditions of grant around PE and sports premium. But as far as the payment date is concerned, as I mentioned, October is still the anticipated date of payment for that. In terms of the grants on this next slide, the main one to draw your attention to is the school supplementary grant. So this was going to be paid in 2 instalments, one of which has already been paid in May and June of 2022. So there is a further instalment of this payment which we expect to pay either at the end of October for local authority maintained schools or at the beginning of November for academies. And that will be the second instalment of this payment for this coming year. On the next slide, the MPQ Targeted Support Fund is probably one of those grants that you may be less familiar with. As I say, this is a new grant for this year that we're currently in the process of rolling out. So we know that the grant will be paid in the summer of 2023, but we can't unfortunately be any more specific with a payment date at this point in time. But there are some initial conditions of grant published for that grant on gov.uk, which are linked at the beginning of this presentation accordingly for you. The only other thing to signpost on this slide is, as I mentioned previously, the slight change to the recovery premium payment dates. So just to be aware of that third instalment, which will be paid at the end of March for local authority maintained schools or the beginning of April for academies. And then finally, just to emphasize again that point around Homes for Ukraine and the expectancy on that next payment, which will be paid at the end of October, which, as I say, will be made up of those 2 separate elements, the remaining 75% that was still due from the first instalment, as well as those new arrivals that have come in after May of this year into the UK. The early career framework funding, once again, we can't give a firm confirmation on when that payment date will be for that particular grant funding, except to say that it will be in the summer of 2023. So once again, obviously, we'll communicate more specifically as soon as we can what the payment date will be for that. For now, the most specific we can be is summer of 2023 accordingly. But that's essentially it, just in terms of a high-level overview of the grants. But as I said at the start, obviously, I'm happy to take any questions, or I've got colleagues on the call that can assist with that as well. So apologies, I'm just looking at the chat now, trying to work my way through any of the questions that I can try and address for you. So just on the question around any grants being available with obviously with energy costs or wider cost of living costs, what I would say on that is obviously we are obviously waiting further instruction, obviously from on that particular subject matter. Needs to say that's a very common question that's coming up frequently at the moment, and we recognise obviously that there's a lot of needs to get clarity on that as soon as possible in terms of what funding is coming down the track. We don't have anything concrete we can confirm at the moment, except to say that obviously when we do know anything further, specifically around energy costs or wider cost of living, we will obviously confirm it accordingly. If there's anything concrete I could say, I would have obviously covered it in this session, because I appreciate it's a very hot topic at the moment accordingly. Yeah, so the payment dates for recovery premium, they're essentially, for the most part, they're the same as they have been in previous years. The only change to recovery premium, as I mentioned, is with that third instalment. So for 21-22 last year, that third instalment was paid, I believe, at the end of April / beginning of May, depending on whether you were local authority or academy. So the only change to recovery premium for this year is that slight change in the payment dates for that third instalment. Instead of end of April / beginning of May, it's going to be end of March / beginning of April. But aside from that, the payment dates should remain the same for recovery premium. Your question there on the Homes for Ukraine grant, I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, is it that you're wanting to know the payment that you've received, how that's broken down by number of pupils and what cohort they fall into, whether it's primary, secondary, and so on. If that's the case, if you want to contact me separately, there is a way we can provide you with a breakdown of your funding so you can see exactly how it's made up of pupil numbers and what cohorts they fall into, if that's what you're needing. So as I say, I don't know if Alex, if you can share my email address separately on that, or I'll put my email address in the chat if you want to just contact me separately and confirm that's the case, and I can help get that information to you, and the same for anybody else, because that is, at the moment, for Homes for Ukraine, that's quite a common question that's coming up from lots of local authorities, which is just wanting that clarity on how their payment is broken down. So if you need that sort of level of detail, we can provide that for you. Asked about Sport PE grant. I mean, as I say, I can ask the question. The fact, as I say, that we haven't published anything as yet on the conditions grant or allocations, as I say, I appreciate, obviously, bearing in mind the payment is imminent next month. I will feed back to the team, ideally, that we need confirmation much earlier for you. And again, I have chased with the policy team today to say we need the information publishing on it ASAP, and they are working to get that. That's very much in train at the moment. So apologies that as I say, currently we don't have information available on that we can signpost you to currently. As far as the underspent on the SLT grant will be repaid, I will check with the policy team on that. I didn't cover that in the presentation, so you didn't miss it. There is obviously for the school-led tutoring at the moment, we've had the end of year online reconciliation forms that have been completed to set out how spending has been carried out on that particular grant. I will check with the policy team on exactly what the process for repayment will look like, where it's decided that that the grant has been underspent accordingly. So I'll follow up on that for you. Okay, well, as I say, thanks everyone for dialing in.